Hey, thanks for joining us in our study of the book of Esther. We only have a couple of more lessons left, and I'm really excited about these because we're going to be winding things down here in this amazing little book of Esther. So just a really quick review here. Some of you may remember from our last study that Queen Esther had prepared a luxurious banquet for King Xerxes and for his right-hand advisor, Haman. Of course, Haman's the enemy of the Jews, and he had already plotted for them to be killed. And in a year's distance from basically the time when we're studying here, there was going to be the big day of battle to annihilate all of the Jews in the Persian Empire. But things are starting to turn around here. Esther reveals to the king that Haman has been trying to not only plot against a certain people, but against her and her people, the Jewish people. The king had no idea. The king rushes out in fury to kind of get control of himself. And then Haman falls over on the sofa where Esther is lying and is wallowing and begging her to save his life. The king comes in and sees him lying on that sofa, and you're even attacking my queen here in my presence. And so here's what happened. The actual impalement that Haman had planned for Mordecai, he actually was impaled on that. He was killed and impaled, placed there by the king, 7 stories up in the sky there above that city. So things are turning around here. The last verse of chapter 7 says this. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's fury had subsided. So now what I want to do is I want us to step into chapter 8, and I'll read and we'll make some comments. In the first verse, here's what we read. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Now, this king moves fast. We've already seen that. Haman had no sooner actually been killed than the king says, okay, we're going to allow you to have his estate. This was the entire possession because really it was owned by the king and it was part of his entire possession. And usually something like this was ransacked, it was looted, it was plundered, and Esther had been given the responsibility of, okay, this is going to be yours now. And it says, and Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. What we find here is like the actual official introduction of who Mordecai was in relationship to Queen Esther. She presented him basically as, this is not only my cousin, but this was my guardian. This is my mentor, the man who raised me. And as she's also telling him that, she's reminding the king of some things. You know, this is the man who told of the 2 men who were going to assassinate you. He saved your life. Remember, here recently, you rewarded him, and you had him marched around the city on the horse and with all of your apparel and shouting that this is the man that the king has blessed. This is my relative. And so this was really an outstanding opportunity for Esther to for the 2 of them to be together standing before King Xerxes. Well, we read in verse 2, the king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. This is really significant when you think about this because the king's signet ring, actually the signet meant to press down. He'd press down and he would seal something that was certified, stating that this is a decree of the king. And he gave this ring that had been worn on the hand of Haman to his new advisor, to Mordecai, to give him the authority, being the second in command of the entire kingdom of Persia. This was quite a statement because Mordecai was a Jew, but he had shown his faithfulness and loyalty to the king. So in verse 3, we read, Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She she begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Now notice in verse 4, then the king extended his gold scepter to Esther as she arose and stood before him. If it pleases the king, she says, and if he rewards me with favor and thinks it is the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, notice she keeps saying, if he does this, if he regards, if he's pleased with me, let him order and let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. I mean, that sounds like a great thing to ask the king. I mean, hey, can you reverse things now? She says, for how can I bear see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? This little woman had poured out her heart before the king, and the king knew it. See, Esther and Mordecai were more than likely safe because they were living within the king's palace. Whenever this day of battle broke out to annihilate all of the Jews, they were probably safe. But thousands and thousands of their people, which at this point there were about 500,000 Jews, remnant Jews, living in this kingdom of Persia in the 127 provinces. So here's what we see. The enemy's been removed, but the decree was an edict by the king, and even the king was unable to renounce or decline or to bring back an edict that he had made, so it had to run its course. The king's decree could not be changed even by him. So what do we do now? Big problem? Verse 7. King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai, the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on a pole he set up. Now write another decree. The king's coming up with a solution. In the king's name, in behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. So the king is saying, I cannot revoke, I can't change a decree that I made, but we can place a new decree and place it in the favor of whatever you think is best. I mean, this is pretty awesome. The king is saying, you decide this. So the decree now is it's just been two months since the first decree had been initially stated. So about 2 months had gone by. There was about 10 months left before this day of battle would occur. We read in verse 9, at the royal secretaries, once the royal secretaries were summoned, on the 23rd day of the third month, the month of Sivan, they wrote out Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, the governors, the nobles of the 127 provinces, stretching from India to Cush. These orders were written in the script of each province and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and he sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. Now, the king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, and to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and their children, and to plunder property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this is in all the provinces of King Xerxes, was the 13th day of the 12th month of the month Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves of their enemies. You see what a wonderful thing. The king gave the opportunity, not only for the Jews to protect themselves, but an edict to go out into all the provinces to explain this, to give them 10 months in advance to be able to plan and prepare to protect their families, to protect everything they owned. It says in verse 14, the couriers riding the royal horses went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. So what we see here is there's going to be a lot of energy and a lot of triumph for the Jews. This was an exciting time. You know, that day when all this really took place and Mordecai walked in his normal clothing into the king's palace, and he walked out of the king's palace that day in a different way and in different clothing. And I just kind of wonder, people who had watched, maybe their mouths dropped open thinking, what in the world has happened here? I can't imagine the looks, because we read in verse 15, when Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing a royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. I'm reminded of what Proverbs tells us. In Proverbs 29:2, it says, when the righteous thrive, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan. And so the joy of Shushan spread to every location that the decree was sent. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy and gladness and honor in every province and every city to which the edict of the king came. There was joy and gladness among the Jews with feasting and celebration. And many of the people of other nationalities, listen to this, became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. This is huge. The turning is wide. But how will this whole thing work out? In chapter 9, we're going to see how God is at work. And so I want us to step into chapter 9 at this moment. In chapter 9, it begins just straightforward. No time is wasted, because we have now immediately arrived at the day that the edict was to be come to fruition, was to happen. We read in verse 1, chapter 9. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On the day of the enemies of the Jews that had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all the people. You know, when I was reading this, I was thinking about, one could say that the Persians were defeated before they even started. That's happened many, many times over the years with the history of the Jews. Just like King Pharaoh and his Egyptian army trying to pursue the Jews in the Red Sea. They were engulfed by the Red Sea, and the soldiers were all killed. They were destined to defeat. Just like King Saul was trying to overturn things with David before David became king. And he made sure that David was turned in to the Philistines to be a part of their battle, and even killed. But what happened? The Philistines came back, and that's where Saul and his son Jonathan were killed in battle that day. So the Persians were destined for destruction, it seems as though. We read in verse 3, and all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work, listen to these next three words, helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all of their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with the slaughter and destruction. And they did what they pleased with those who hated them. See, the Jews, they weren't vindictive. They weren't wanting to kill anyone. They were just wanting to protect what was theirs. And this is where they had the opportunity to defend themselves. And in Shushanath, citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. I mean, right there in the main capital city, 500 men were killed. Also, Parshandatha, Dalphon, Ashpatha, Poratha, Adelia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisi, Aradea, and Vahastha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. They killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. Now, I want to make note here. The Jews had a right to raid their enemies as their enemies were going to raid them. Take anything that they wanted to take, destroy their households, take all of their goods, all of their animals, all of their people, anything they wanted to do. But as we read this, we're going to see it clearly defines the intention of the Jewish people was not to plunder. They were simply trying to protect themselves. They literally only fought for their deliverance, their self-preservation. Now, I want you to notice the demeanor here of the king. In one day, his Persians, who had tried to annihilate the Jews, were destroyed. These were his people. And we have a calm king who's in control of his emotions. Because it says in verse 11, on that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan, the citadel, was brought to the king. So he knew how many. And the king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the citadel, and 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you, or what is your further request, and it shall be done. Esther and her people were threatened with extermination by Haman, and yet the enemies plotted their actual own demise. Now, with this royal edict that has now been passed and that day of battle has occurred, everything could go back to normal, right? Those who hated the Jews, they could continue their hating, right? Well, the state of contentment was either going to be secure right now or it was going to be spoiled. And we're going to find out if it was secure or if it was spoiled for the enemy of the Jews when we conclude the last lesson in the book of Esther. I hope you'll join me for that lesson.